Hello, friends. Welcome back to the While We're Waiting Hope After Child Loss podcast. I'm Jill Sullivan, your host and one of the co-founders of the While We're Waiting ministry. This is a podcast of stories of devastating loss and grief and heartbreak and struggle, and stories of hope and healing and faith and, yes, even joy. Underlying every conversation is the hope we have in Jesus Christ, which makes it possible to not just survive the loss of a child, but to live well while we're waiting to see them again in heaven one day. You can learn more about our ministry and the free bereaved parent retreats we host by visiting our website at www.whilewe'rewaiting.org. Welcome to episode number 265. Today, I'm honored to be joined by Clarissa Moll, an award-winning writer and podcaster who has become a trusted voice for those walking through grief. Her book, Beyond the Darkness, A Gentle Guide for Living with Grief and Thriving After Loss, has been a tremendous help to me personally and to many other grieving people as well. Clarissa is not a bereaved parent, but as a young widow, she has unique insights into grief and offers encouragement to those seeking hope in the shadow of sorrow. She's also the author of several other books on grief, including Hurt, Help, Hope, a real conversation about teen grief and life after loss, and her newest work for children, Hope Comes to Stay. This tender and beautifully written story is a practical resource for parents who are trying to help their children understand and process grief, especially when words are hard to find. In our conversation today, Clarissa shares from her own journey of loss, talks about practical ways we can support grieving children, and points us to the sustaining hope we have in Christ. I'm so glad you joined me today. Hi, Clarissa. Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I have been looking forward to visiting with you. But before we get started, would you give us just a little bit of an introduction? Tell us where you're from and what life is like for you there.
Sure. I live in Boston and enjoy life in a blended family of 9. My husband is a widower and I am a widow. And together we have 7 children between the two of us, along with 3 dogs and a cat. So there's never a dull moment here. I am the producer and moderator for Christianity Today's flagship news podcast, The Bulletin. And I have a very full life, a very full and deeply satisfying life here.
Yeah, it sounds like a very busy life as well.
It is.
Well, you are not the typical guest that I have on my podcast because my listeners are primarily bereaved parents, and those are the folks that I usually interview. But you are very familiar with grief. And, there are aspects of grief that are universal, no matter what the type of loss is. And you have written beautifully about grief and your journey with grief in your book, Beyond the Darkness. But before we get into that, tell me just a little bit about your story. I know your life changed in 2019 when your husband, Rob, was killed in a sudden accident. Would you talk about that?
That's right. Yeah, 6 years ago. It's hard to believe that it has been so long. And for any of your listeners, I'm sure they feel that same way, that in so many ways, time pulls us forward, and yet there is a moment that feels like it is so immediate and still so very raw and present to us. In 2019, my husband, Rob, fell to his death in a hiking accident in the middle of our family vacation in the backcountry of Mount Rainier National Park. Police chaplains arrived at my campsite to give me the news, to tell me and to tell my 4 children that he wasn't coming home, that we would never see him again. My children were ages just turned 7 to 13. I had 4 young children there. And so together we have walked over the last 6 years through, it seems like, almost every developmental stage of grief, learning how to receive grief as that unwelcome visitor, to take it with us to the baseball diamond, to the dance recital, to all of these places that life calls us to go, and to figure out how to build a life that we can really love, genuinely love again, even as we exist with this gaping hole, this absence of a person that we deeply love and still long to have with us even all these years later.
Yeah, absolutely. That never goes away, does it? We always
No, it
have that
doesn't.
longing.
That's
One
right.
of the things that I loved about your book is how you personified grief as a companion. What was the process of coming to that recognition after Rob's death, and how can we make friends with our grief?
I think after Rob died, I desperately wanted to just get through the hardest and rawest, most difficult parts of grief. And I had this idea that grief was like a marathon, that I just sort of girded myself for it and pushed through. I would finally hit a finish line. I would get done with this hard thing. And what I discovered quickly was that there was no getting done with it. He would always be gone, and grief would go with me everywhere I went. And so the idea of grief as this linear journey just didn't work. It wasn't realistic to how we lived our lives with loss. And so I began with the help of a grief counselor to think through what are some of the other images for what grief might look like in my life. And thinking about someone who arrives with bags packed and shows up in my kitchen, shows up in my living room, shows up in my bedroom. Yeah, that was how grief was, because I felt grief at the kitchen table. I felt it as I climbed into bed at night. I felt it in the shower as I wept to get ready for the day. I felt it at the office. Grief as a companion just felt so like the life that I was living. And not only was it resonant with the life that I was living, it felt like perhaps if grief became a companion, there would be a possibility beyond just surviving. And even as I desperately wanted and still want my husband back again, I knew that I couldn't live in that limbo. I hadn't died, even though he had, and I had to figure out how to live again. And if I could live with grief as a companion, maybe I could figure out how to do it.
Yeah, that's very helpful. I appreciate that. You devote an entire chapter in your book to the physical dimensions of grief.
Mhm.
Talk about how grief can affect us physically and how we can manage that in our lives.
Well, when we think about grief, we often go straight to the emotions, right? Sadness,
Mm,
anger, frustration,
it's true.
denial, of these things.
Mhm.
But if you have had a 3-year-old and your 3-year-old has melted down in that Target aisle, you know that there are a couple very basic questions that are running through your head. Is my child hungry? Is my child tired? We ask ourselves these questions because they are basic to who we are. We are whole people. We're not
That's
just bodies, we're not just emotions. We are integrated people. And so when we're thinking about how to steward our grief well, how to care for our whole selves, we want to think about, what does rest look as I'm shouldering heavy grief? What does nourishment mean?
mhm.
Some of us really lose our appetites, or we start eating in funny ways that aren't normal to our normal patterns of eating. What does nourishment look like? What does movement look like? There's so much research around movement, gentle movement, as a way of processing and working through some of grief's hardest moments. It's very much rooted in our bodies. And as we take care of our bodies, I think that overflows into some of these more complicated areas that take a lot more work in stewarding well.
Mhm. Definitely. Most of our listeners are probably familiar with Pigpen from the Charlie Brown cartoons. You have a metaphor that you like to use related to Pigpen. What is
Yes.
that?
Well, I feel like my life with grief is so much like Pigpen. He's got all this stuff swirling around him, and it's hard to see through it. And there are so many emotions that come with grief that our culture, frankly, doesn't do a very good job of helping us to understand. We don't know how to hold the peace, perhaps, that comes after watching someone who has suffered long come to a state of final rest in death, with the great horror of death itself. We don't know how to hold on to the love and the anger all at once. We have all of these things swirling around in our minds and in our hearts, and it's hard to see through all of that clutter. And so, as I think about my own life with grief, it's a lot of slowing down, letting the dust settle, trying to take time and space wherever I can find it to listen to all those different voices that are speaking in my mind who desperately want to be heard, receiving them with self compassion and kindness, and honoring the complexity of what I'm experiencing because it is a lot and we don't get a lot of training for it before it hits us.
That's right. And I think you can carry that pig pen analogy out a little bit too. We've got that cloud swirling around us that makes the people around us uncomfortable.
Yes, it
And
does.
so, yeah, how can we deal with that?
It's really hard when you have lost a loved one and you turn to the people who have supported you for many years and they're silent,
Yeah,
uh, they're absent, they turn their backs on you, they say things that are deeply hurtful. It's hard to know how to get close to people and who is safe to get close to after
that's
we
right.
experience loss. Very challenging. And a lot of it is trial and error.
Mhm.
And the difficulty with that trial and error is that we are so tender and bruised already that any touch, even a well meaning but misplaced kind of touch, in a word that's meant to be comforting but feels like a platitude, in a text that feels perfunctory when we needed deeper connection, all of those can cause us to turn inward to say, I'm just going to build some walls around myself to
Mhm.
protect myself because I am so hurt. But the problem that we find is that we're all alone. We build walls around ourselves to protect ourselves, but those walls actually wall other people out. And so, as we're thinking about who can be my support circle, who can enter into that pig pen mess with me,
That's right.
sometimes we need to get creative. For example, there was one gentleman who showed up to be an amazing character in our family support system story. He was our family electrician.
Mm.
He showed up after my breaker box started sparking and I didn't know what to do. He helped fix it. And then he began just showing up to check on us.
Mm.
Hey, do you need any work done? I'm available, or checking in to make sure that the microwave that I had attempted to install with my 10-year-old son was still working. He even gave us a tape measure with Moll family written on it in Sharpie as a way of sort of blessing us and equipping us to do work on our own. And I never would have said to you, hey, my electrician's going to be a core member of my support system. But there he was. And because I hadn't walled myself too tightly, I was able to receive him.
Yeah. A dad said at one of our retreats recently, if we harden our hearts, we get a hard heart.
That
And
is so
that's a
true.
very simple phrase, but I've thought about it ever since he said that. And I thought, we as grieving parents, we tend to harden ourselves against the world and against people who may inadvertently hurt us. And so I think that's important. What you
Yeah,
just said is to welcome people in and to allow them to be there for us. And those people are gifts from God. That electrician
they
was
are.
a gift in your life, and that
Yeah.
is special. When our daughter Hannah died 16 years ago, no one in the Christian community was talking about lament. And I'm so thankful that's beginning to change. In your book, you actually have a chapter where you talk about Naomi as one of
Mhm.
the original lamenters. I've heard the story of Naomi all my life, but I never have thought about her in that way. She was a widow like you and a grieving parent. So, talk about what we can learn from Naomi.
Oh, I so appreciate Naomi and all the characters in scripture. She's just a grump. From the very
Yeah.
beginning, she tells it like it is. She does not mince words. When her friends welcome her back to town, she says, just call me bitter. She is not going to try to sugarcoat her sadness at all. And I so appreciate that honesty because there are days in my experience of loss where I don't want to be helped. Thank you very much. I just
That's
want
right.
to feel
Hmm.
sad and or angry or frustrated at the lot that I am in. And I appreciate her honesty. I feel like the Lord was so generous in giving us that picture of her. But through the book of Ruth, we see the kindness of others begin to soften her heart. We see the love of her daughter in law begin to transform her vision for what is possible, so that by the end of the book of Ruth, there is a new grandson that is set in her lap. And those same friends who attempted to greet her at the beginning and who were rebuffed now say, look, the Lord has given a child to Naomi. They're able to rejoice with her. And that's what we're longing for, right? Is friends who will weep with us when we are weeping, rejoice with us when we are rejoicing. But it takes a level of vulnerability and honesty, both in ourselves and from those who are willing to walk beside us. And I think Naomi is a perfect picture of the kind of vulnerability that is really required for that intimate love and connection to happen.
I think you're right. I enjoyed that part of your book in particular. So let's shift our focus to children's grief, which is the focus of your newest book, Hope Comes to Stay. Your children, you mentioned that they were 7, 10, 12, and 14, I think, when Rob died. What did you learn about parenting children through grief in the aftermath of their great loss?
The first thing I learned was that it was nothing like my own experience, that adult grief was
Sure.
very different from childhood grief, from teenager grief. It was an entirely different animal altogether. And so, what was going to be required of me was that I throw out whatever guidebook I think I had developed in my own head and sit at their feet and be a student of them. Really
Mm,
observe,
yeah.
watch, get to know them, not simply the emotions related to their loss, but the things that animated them, the things that made them excited or scared or frustrated, all the kind of intimate parenting connections that we hope to develop with our children. I needed to dial in and double down and do those things. And
Yeah.
alongside of that, I realized that for much of their everyday life, they just wanted to be normal. They didn't wanna talk about
Mm,
their grief all the time like I did as a mom. They wanted to go out in
sure.
the yard and kick the soccer ball around. And yes, when someone fell and skinned a knee, it would quickly become about dad dying and not about the knee that was skinned.
Sure.
And so I knew that those emotions were close beneath the surface, but they so deeply wanted to be normal. The New York Life Foundation has created a child bereavement study that is a long study that they conduct, and they develop new research every year. 1 in 12 children will lose a parent or a sibling before they turn 18, and here in
Wow.
the US. And we know that there are two core things that these children report to this study that say that make all the difference. One of them is, will you show that you care for the long haul? Will you show up for me? Remember my person with me? Drive me to youth group or show up at my school play to cheer me on? And will you treat me like I'm normal? And those are the
Mm,
two biggest
it's
parts
huge.
of helping a child move toward resilience through one of the most difficult experiences of their lives. And I had to learn how to do that because I wanted to bubble wrap my kids. I didn't want any more loss ever to touch them ever again. I wanted to protect them from all the bad things that could ever happen. But I quickly discovered that was sort of stifling. It wasn't really a pathway to a life that was worth living.
Yeah, I do think that's our natural inclination as parents is we want to shield our children from any more grief and any more loss. And of course, we can't do that. I love what you said about that, what that survey showed, that the children want to be normal. I think that's so true.
Yes. Yeah, and so, as I have written a teen book for teenagers who are grieving with my daughter who is a college student, helping students who are wrestling with how do I understand grief as I go to prom and I think about my future
Mm.
and all of those big life milestones that happen during the teenage years. It's the same kind of work that I bring to this new work for children, saying, how do I cope with the everyday parts of my life? How do I enjoy the sunshine and playing outside when my person has died? How do I talk honestly about death and dying without using euphemisms so that I really understand what's going on and aren't scared by it? These are all the kind of basic lessons that we want to begin with children when they're very little. And yeah, it can start when a child is very young.
Yeah, that's good. In your book, Hope Comes to Stay, you introduce us to a little girl named Leela and her family's journey after the loss of Papa. How does Leela's story mirror the real emotional path that many children experience?
Well, at the beginning of the book, you see Leela in a cemetery with a puzzled look on
Yeah.
her face. You see her at home as folks bring food to the grieving family, kind of having difficulty figuring out where to stand in the room, how to behave.
Yeah.
You see her escaping from all of the hubbub and asking questions that don't have easy answers. It's all of these things that are about the puzzlement of grief for very little children because they're such concrete thinkers. They struggle with abstraction. When our children are very young, we teach them object permanence, that if mom walks out of the room, she will walk back in. And so it's really
Right.
hard for a little mind to reverse these kind of things when death shows up. But then we also see Leela engage in the normal warp and woof of daily life, the playing outside, the going to school, the
Hmm.
having to figure out how to steward her story as a little girl, and having her mother walk with her through the entire journey. Uh, you know, Studies around adverse childhood experiences say that one trusted adult can make all the difference in the life of a child who has experienced a significant loss. And that's the picture that we wanted to make sure was very clear in this book, that never in a moment would Leela believe that she was alone in this, that she would have the
Mm.
freedom to go out and explore the world and grow and change, but there would always be a safe person in her mother to return to ask questions of, to grow along with her as they had this shared loss, but also had unique loss as well.
Hmm. Very good. In the story, Leela meets a surprising new friend.
Mhm.
How does that friend help Leela, and by extension, young readers process grief?
Well, it takes the form of a bear, and this bear travels with her everywhere she goes. And so it is, again, that picture of a companion that sometimes brings her strength and courage, sometimes is a source of comfort or happy memories. And Leela realizes that she can take grief wherever she goes. And that's the lesson that we want to share with young children.
Hmm. What message do you hope families will take away from this book?
When I think about the pathway of childhood grieving and the developmental pathway that children undergo as they move from their early years through the teenage years and into adulthood, we know that re-grieving is real and that it takes place. That as a child emerges in his or her understanding of their loss, that they will grieve new and different and deeper things as time goes by. And so we need to begin these conversations early. We teach our children when they're very little their ABCs, basic math facts, their colors, all of these kinds of things. Why? Because we want to equip them with the building blocks for a language that will help them move about through the world as they grow and change. And as we talk to children about grief and loss, whether they have experienced it in a way that they can remember, because we want to be clear that for some little children, their memory of their person may be very foggy, or in a way that
Hmm.
they need to anticipate. We're actually equipping them with a language of compassion for themselves, of consolation for others. We're expanding their vision of what life is and what its possibilities are. And that begins with simple and easy steps, even when a child is very young.
And I think that's really important because I feel like for children, grief evolves much more than it does for us as adults. As they grow older and they reach different levels of maturity, they realize more of what they're missing when their person is gone. I've seen that in my own daughter as she's grieved her sister. So I think that's really important. I love the idea of giving them that vocabulary so that when those things come along, they're prepared and they know how to talk about them.
One of the amazing things that happened when my daughter Fiona, who is my co author on our teen book, headed to college, she began to notice that there were other students around her as a freshman in college who had also experienced loss. Oh, there
Yeah.
was a guy she met in a class who had recently lost his dad. There's someone who has lost a sibling. It was almost as though her radar was attuned to the kind of suffering and pain that others in the world experience. And When I look at her life, the tenderness of her years in losing someone so very dear to her, when I think about her future of not having dad to walk her down the aisle, to not be there to hold her first baby, his grandbaby, it's very hard for me. But
Sure.
when I think about that radar, that awareness of the suffering in the world, I think, wow, that's what I want for my children. I want
Right.
them to be tender to the world's suffering. I want their hearts to break for the things that break the heart of God. And while I never, never would have chosen this path for them, I wish that they didn't have to learn it this way. It is one of the hidden gifts of our loss and of our grief, that we are not calcified, as you said earlier, and hardened by our grief, but that our hearts are actually broken open in a
Mm,
way that allows us to expand care and love and deep, deep compassion for those who are around us.
absolutely. And that is such a gift. And I see that in my daughter, who is now an adult, but it was hard won,
It
but I'm
was.
thankful for where God has her now and what she's learned and how she's able to minister to other people. What are some practical ways that families can encourage healthy conversations and emotional resilience in children after loss?
Mm. Well, there's never the wrong time to start. If we wait for the perfect time, we'll never do it because that first step is scary.
Mhm.
And so I always encourage families to start small. If you have a loss that is very present and very raw, start talking about the basics. It was a knife to the heart when my 7-year-old asked me, "What is cremation?" But I realized I needed to explain that to her because
Sure.
the idea of where daddy was really scary to her. And information is power. And so we
Mhm.
think about, what does our child want to know and what do they need to know? And so we steward that information, giving them what they need at an age appropriate level, developmentally appropriate level, when the need is immediate. And when the need isn't immediate, we make sure that conversations about death, about loss, pain, suffering are woven into the normal parts of our day. I love that you brought up the idea of lament because there are so many psalms of lament in the Bible. It is a very normal song for the church to sing. And so, as we normalize conversations about loss, whether it's making note of the dead leaves that fall in the autumn, waiting all winter as the bare trees stand empty until that first flush of green in the spring, whether we talk about a pet dying or we pray as an ambulance drives by. Any of these things are easy ways to start those kind of conversations that can be woven into the regular experience of a child's life, giving them language over time to develop that kind of fluency.
That is such good advice. So, how can people get a copy of your new book or the Beyond the Darkness book? How can people get connected with you?
Sure, you can visit my website at Clarissa Moll. It's Moll like doll, clarissamoll.com. You can visit me on Instagram. I love to hang out with listeners and readers there. And all of my books are available from your favorite bookseller, Amazon, or whatever. It is a joy to be able to provide these resources to families just like mine. Grief is unique, as you said, but it's also universal. And there's something really beautiful that binds us together as we grieve together and as we look to rejoice together in the midst of that grief. And of course, for those people of faith, as we look to the ultimate hope that we have in Jesus.
Amen. We are looking forward to that day, aren't we?
Amen.
Thank you so much for joining me today and for sharing about your books and just for the work that you do with the grieving community. I appreciate it very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining me for another episode of the While We're Waiting Hope After Child Loss podcast. If this podcast has been a blessing to you, please take just a moment to leave a rating or a review, and please feel free to share it with someone you know who might be helped by it. We're so grateful for all of you who come back and listen every week, and those of you who may be listening for the very first time. I hope God has used it to encourage you today and to help you live well while you're waiting.